So far in this series, we explored many of the business opportunities and challenges brands face going to this marketplace. Now, while some things can be learned, arguably things like the media platforms, even the local cultural nuances, what about some of the more subjective areas? The biggest one being creativity. That's what we're going to explore in this episode. While the West prides itself on its creativity, founded on strong strategic ideas, in the East, quite often it's perceived as a copying culture, a direct response culture, or sometimes just wild and wacky, and sometimes a combination of all three. Like most generalizations, the truth is normally very, very different. As we discussed previously, the idea of marketing and advertising is still relatively new here in Asia. So while we are starting to see some brilliant young creators coming through, it's going to take a while for them to stamp their authority. So until that happens, here's some observations, not rules, but some observations about creativity in the region. Firstly, I know this is really hard to do, especially if you're in a global role and you need a lot of patience, but think local relevance first and global conformity second. And by locally relevant, I just don't mean about the idea, but also mean the execution of that idea as well. Throughout the years, there's been many examples of big brands that have tried to helicopter in their big white box strategy into the local market and unfortunately failed. MediaMarkt being a great example of a very successful European brand that could not succeed in China. The businesses and brands that have been the most successful have taken this approach to being locally relevant first, globally compliant second. Good examples: DFS, the world's biggest luxury retailer, and Carrefour. On the brand side, businesses like Coca-Cola interestingly have used crowdsourcing as a great way to gain local insights very quickly, but also to test new creative ideas. Unfortunately, as we discussed, with such a great vast landmass and different cultures, there's not one size that fits all, because there is not one Asia, as we know. Take for example Japan. What tends to work there tends to be a combination of great typography married with great visual iconic images. Why? Because Japanese typography is far more visual language than we have in the West. It is vastly different from Thailand, where quite often humour is used as a way for cutting through. After all, it is a land of the smiles. And then you have Australia, where creative artistry and the ability to take an idea across many channels is the way to go. It's a simple fact: an idea that works well in Seattle or Sheffield is unlikely to work perfectly well in Seoul, Sydney or Shanghai. The reality is, hopefully you will find some common global insights. I love the idea of Johnson's baby, the insight when a baby is born, so is a mum, that will work across countries. But the execution of that idea is going to be different market by market. Observation number 2, and probably should be a rule, is to think the screen in your pocket first and every other screen after that second. Why? Well, if you look at the demographics and the age of the population growth here in Asia, there's a very youthful population. That means the majority of people have only ever experienced the internet, and hence a lot of content, actually on their mobile phone rather than on a desktop or a tablet. Combine that with the fact that Asia has some of the highest penetration of smartphone users, with Singapore and South Korea being number 1 and 2, and also increasingly people are only using their smartphone to access the internet, Malaysia being the highest of that in any country around the world. I would argue, in order to create truly great creative work in this region, it needs to be able to work brilliantly on a smartphone or mobile. There was the old cliche: if a great idea could not be written on a post-it note, then it wasn't a great idea at all. I think that needs to be updated, say it now must work on a mobile phone or maybe even a smartwatch. Because the reality is, if it doesn't, your idea is not either smart enough, good enough, and it definitely won't be effective enough in this region. The third and final observation, and it's probably the biggest elephant in the room when it comes to marketing in Asia, is the power of celebrity, because it seems to be everywhere. We've probably all seen those great Tommy Lee Jones commercials where he seems to sell everything from coffee to rice cakes, or those kind of weird and wacky James Brown commercials where he's selling instant miso soup. If you haven't seen them, I urge you to watch them. It will cheer up your Monday morning. But it's easy to mock, but maybe we shouldn't at first glance. So to summarize, first of all, make sure you spend the time and the energy to understand if your idea and your insights truly work at a local level. 2, really challenge yourself to make sure that your ideas work as well on the small screen as they do on the big screen. And finally, whether we like it or not, the idea of celebrity is probably here to stay for a little while. So it probably does have a purpose, but don't overuse it. In the next episode, which is sadly our last episode, you'll be pleased to hear there's no stats. It's more final observations. There'll be some hints and tips for those who live outside Asia, how to make your Asian colleagues love you. And if you work here in Asia, some hints and tips that maybe you can pass on to your non-Asian friends who make your life a little bit easier.